Good day, selamat datang and welcome to the virtual colloquium by Institute of Teacher Education, International Languages Campus, or better known as IPG KBA, with the theme Capacity Building, Educational Leadership and Management. I am Selvanayagi Shanmugam, your moderator. I'm a lecturer in IPG KBA and will be hosting this interesting session today. If you are new to this webinar series, welcome, selamat datang, and I hope you will stay tuned till the end of the session because today we have a very special speaker from our neighboring country, Singapore. Before we get to know her, let me lay out a few housekeeping matters. First, everyone who attends this webinar series will be given an e-certificate at end of October. Therefore, don't forget to register yourself now. For international participants, your IC number is 111111. Second, we would love to hear from you during today's presentation. If you have any questions for our speaker, please feel free to send it through the chat box. The speaker will be answering questions at the end of the session. If we don't answer your question during today's webinar, we will be sure to follow up afterwards. And last, we would like to encourage you to share today's webinar with your social networks. Now, let me introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Heng Teng Tang. Dr. Heng is an associate professor at the National Technological University, National Institute of Education, Singapore. Her current research lies in the intersection of educational change and comparative education. Previously, Dr. Heng has worked as a teacher, officer with the Ministry of Education Singapore, instructional designer, and education consultant in both the non- and for-profit sector in Singapore and abroad. So, without any further ado, welcoming Dr. Heng. To you, Dr. Heng.
Thank you very much, Dr. Selva. Good morning, everybody. I'm very honored to be here today. And thank you so much for inviting me to this. So I think that while the borders are closed across many different countries, it's actually a blessing that we are still able to connect through these ways using the internet. So I'm very happy that you're here. And I understand that some of you are coming in from many different time zones. For those of you who are in a different time zone, thank you very much for staying up late or being awake early just to be present. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about my session. And my session today is on contextual implications on leading curricular and pedagogical change. Basically, well, it's quite a long title, but really the heart of this is about understanding when we think about curricular and pedagogical change, what is the role of context here? Okay, so okay, so a quick session overview for what we're going to do today. Firstly, I am going to try to keep this interactive, so I'll actually like to poll all of you. So we'll begin with a poll later on. And to poll all of you, it's one way in which I can understand where all of you are coming from. And so we can use the results from these polls and think about how to make connections to the content that I'm actually presenting today. And then secondly, after we have done the poll, we'll move into talking about a case study on curricular and pedagogical change in Singapore. And this case study actually comes from my own research in studying how some teachers in Singapore, how do they deal with differentiated instruction and what are the experiences around it and what are the challenges and what are some of these issues that they face in dealing with a new education approach from a different context. And then thirdly, we will look at the implications of context on leading curricular and pedagogical change. I imagine this would be the piece that many of you would be interested in because I think many of you are actually in leadership positions. So what then do we do about this idea of context when we're actually transferring or borrowing educational ideas from a different context from another country? And then finally, we'll leave some time for questions. Okay, so this was a quick overview of today's session. So now let's start with the poll. There are 3 ways to join the poll today. What you will need to do is to open one more tab in your internet browser. you can go to www.wooclap.com/capital BZUIOF. So it's BZUIOF. Or you can just go to www.wooclap.com and then you enter the event code, which is BZUIOF, right in the top bar. There's a blue bar at the top and it says code, event code. You can enter it there. Or the third way is to scan the QR code to get in. Okay, so those of you, if you have your mobile phone and you prefer to actually enter this poll using your mobile phone, you can scan using this QR code. So I will pause for a while so that you can get in. So once you get in, you'll see a question there and then you can answer the question. Okay. So because I am going to switch screen now, I would like to toggle my screen so that we can actually see the results that's coming out in the poll so that I can get a sense of whether or not participants are able to get into the poll. For those of you who are still trying to get in, if you could just write down this link right now, okay? Or if you could take a picture of this slide so that you can refer to the slide, that will be helpful because in about a minute's time, I'm going to switch screen to the next screen so we can see the poll answers. Okay, so if you can go to this link, you are staring at the poll now. Okay. So over here, if you can look over here, this is where right at the top, that's the link, www.wooclap.com/BZUIOF. Open an internet browser, or a new tab, and enter this into this link. Once you enter, you will see that there'll be a question over there, so you can actually input your answers. Okay, so I understand for some people, you may also have a bit of difficulties getting into the poll. Do not worry about that. I mean, if you are not able to participate in it, it's fine. You can take a look at the results on the screen. So the question is, think about new educational ideas. Think about new education ideas your school or your district or your education system is implementing. To what extent do you think the ideas are from overseas. Okay, to what extent are the ideas that your school or your district, your education district or your education system, the ideas that they're implementing, to what extent are some of these ideas from overseas? Okay. So I think people are getting in now. So the results are coming in much faster. Okay, so let's take a pause here. So don't worry if you're not able to get in and poll and so on. So let's take a look at what so far people have written. Okay, so about half of you or 50% of you, most of you say that to some extent these new education ideas are actually coming from overseas, from a different context. Yeah, right. And then about 30% of you says that, well, actually, to a very large extent, right, or to a large extent, these ideas are coming from a different context. Okay, 20% says, well, there's only only to a small extent that these education ideas are from overseas. Okay, so as the poll numbers keep coming in and more people are signing into this poll, we can see that the numbers keep shifting for this. But by and large, okay, by and large, we have the sense, it seems, okay, we get the sense that for most of you, okay, it seems that not at all or I don't know. Okay, not at all is not an option. Okay, so really there is always some influence, right, of these education ideas that you are trying out in school or that your teachers are trying out in schools. That some of these ideas are coming from a different national context or different origin context. Okay, great. So for those of you, I understand there are some of you who are in the poll, but you may not have answered yet, or maybe you're reserving your answers and you don't want to answer, that's fine. Let's look at the next question now. If you can answer the next question. Okay. Now, if these ideas, and I think everybody would answer this question because nobody answered not at all in the previous question. If education ideas are actually coming from overseas, if they do come from overseas, what country or countries are they coming from? If you look at your tab again, or your screen, you will see that the question has changed on your screen. So if educational ideas do come from overseas, then what country or countries are they coming from? Can you enter the country, one country per entry? Okay, you can type a country and then you click enter, and multiple entries are allowed. So if you think that the educational ideas are coming from many different countries, then you can type in different countries, but you always have to put in one entry each. Okay, so if you look at your tab now, you will see that the question on your device has actually changed already. So if you can just input your answers now. So I'm slowly waiting. No worries about it, because I understand also from Dr. Selva and the Secretariat that sometimes the internet connection may be kind of fickle for some of you, so it may be a bit challenging sometimes to enter the responses, right? So it's okay. I mean, we'll wait, okay, for some more responses. Okay, so I think the responses are coming in slightly faster now. So if we can take a look at the word cloud, you can see that the word cloud is changing very quickly, correct? So one of the biggest words, it seems that represents their multiple entries around there will be that the ideas, many of these education ideas, it seems, are coming from the UK, right? The United Kingdom is over here as well. And then there's USA, Australia. A few of you talk about Western countries, Western or colonial masters. Okay, so there's also Finland, from India as well, and also where is it? Mostly Asian countries. So we see that it seems like there is a mix of where these educational ideas are coming from. In which these curricular and pedagogical ideas that your school or your staff are using, right? So it appears that most of them seems to be coming from the West, Australia, UK, the US, and then also there's some influence also from other Asian countries, perhaps the contexts that are closer to you. All right. So I mean, by and large, the idea to take away from this is that these education ideas come from many different spaces, many different locations, and they're from a different country of origin. Yeah. All right, great. So I'm going to move on to the next question now. To the next question, okay? The next question is, okay, so when I click to the next question on your screen, it will change again. Yeah, okay, on your screen, it will change again. So the next question is, what kinds of challenges do you or your staff encounter when you implement these educational ideas from overseas, be it from Finland or from the UK or from Australia or from India or from Asia? Maybe list one or two challenges. Just make it very short, a very short answer. What are one or two challenges your staff encounter when implementing these ideas from overseas? Just keep it very short, okay? So don't worry about typing very long details about the challenges. Maybe try to summarize the challenges that you or your staff encounter when you implement these educational ideas from overseas, be it from Finland or from the UK or from Australia or from Asia or from India or from previous colonial, masters? Okay, so we can see some of you are typing in some of your responses here. Okay, I'll just wait a little longer. So for those of you, if you can see the screen, you can get a sense of what are some of these responses. Okay, so let's take a quick look at this. Okay, some of these challenges that you have raised. Okay, the challenges that you or your staff encounter in trying to implement education ideas coming in from a different origin context. Okay, it seems like someone also shares that these are some of the other countries that other countries are Britain and Saudi Arabia, where some of these education ideas are coming from. So let's look at these responses. Lack of the necessary knowledge, skills, and capacity to implement these foreign education ideas, suiting it to the local context, getting a buy-in from all that's concerned, or sometimes having misconceptions with new ideas, okay, or government policy, or getting all the stakeholders to understand the concept. Okay, failure to implement successfully due to contextual differences, culture background, different culture, adaptation. So it's very interesting. You can see some patterns in your responses, right? In these patterns in your responses, the kind of challenges that you face, we see the notion of culture repeating, different cultural context or cultural background. We see the notion of context. You're bringing up this idea that because there's contextual differences, there's also difficulties in implementing, and then also getting stakeholders to understand the concept, right? Trying to actually cascade down these ideas, but the stakeholders may not understand what these ideas are or trying to get buy-in from them. Okay, so navigating with different communication styles, prioritization of communication in office is a challenge. Yes, great. So very good. This is very helpful for me because I'm not able to see all of you now. So I think it's always very helpful, and I always find it useful to help me get a sense of who my audience is. That's why I usually like to have some kind of a poll to get a sense. So you have a sense of I have a sense of these are the issues that's happening in your context. Okay. So now let me share on this case study in Singapore now. Okay. So um, basically, this case study or this issues of movement of educational ideas is set within this notion of educational transfer. So educational transfer is the movement of education policies, ideas, or approaches from one country to another, okay? From what we usually call the source country or the origin country to the destination country, okay? And over the past few decades, there's been an increase in educational transfer around the world. Why? Because of many reasons, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Globalization, people look at social media, they're watching YouTube videos about teaching in another country. Maybe after watching it, they think, oh, that's interesting, I can try that out too, right? Or it could be about maybe people are traveling overseas for their education, and then in learning about these new educational ideas, they want to bring it back. Or it could be that they do field study trips to, for example, Finland, especially these countries, in the global league tables, um, like PISA and TIMSS or Pearls, countries, like Finland or Singapore or Korea or Chinese cities like Shanghai, they're all doing very well in the global league cities. So countries oftentimes, they see these, oh, they're doing supposedly very well in the league tables. What can we do to emulate that? So there's a lot of these borrowing of educational ideas from elsewhere. Also, global institutions like the World Bank and UN, whenever they push through reforms, they may also stipulate that if we want this money or this loan, then there's a certain condition that you have to change reform your education in certain ways. So that in the past few decades, we see that there are these changes in education, and there's more and more movement of educational ideas around the world. But the education transfer movement, right? The transfer of education ideas is a very complex issue, as all of you have pointed out, in terms of the challenges that you are reporting to face. Okay. So some of these questions are supposed best practices really, really transferable? And to what extent does it work then when it's transferred? Okay. Some of these best practices or supposedly useful or good educational ideas. Okay. So through this case study for my research, I wanted to get a sense of how teachers in Singapore, how do they make sense of this educational approach called differentiated instruction? And differentiated instruction is an educational approach that is borrowed from the USA. Okay, so just a very quick background about why DI. I'm going to call differentiated instruction DI for short in my presentation, okay, because differentiated instruction is quite a mouthful. So why is DI so increasingly popular in Singapore? So if we look at this slide, okay, this is the context in Singapore, okay? Our population is changing very rapidly, right? We have our non-resident population increasing from 19% to 29%, okay? And then the Singapore citizen population at 60%. So almost 1 in 3 Singapore residents, people living in Singapore, are actually not growing up in Singapore. So they are coming from many different countries. They come here to work, to study, to live, they migrate here, right? So our schools are feeling, our teachers are feeling that differences as well, okay? That increasingly their students are increasingly diverse. So in view of this increasing diversity in the classroom, and also in view of the need to be more appreciative of the learner and for a more holistic and value-centered education where the learner is centered, okay? The Ministry of Education has recommended, okay, one of many ways, differentiated instruction as one of many other ways in which one can respond to this changing diversity in schools. So as you can see over here, we have introduced greater flexibility and choice in education of past years to cater to the diverse abilities and interests of our schools. There's an increasing recognition in Singapore education system that our students are increasingly diverse in terms of their backgrounds, their readiness, as well as their interests. So schools will be encouraged to adopt a flexible approach, including the implementation of differentiated instruction within the same class. So it's been for a few years, there's been talk of this notion of differentiated instruction, but it's really only the recent years, maybe 2 to 5 years, that differentiated instruction or DI is becoming increasingly popular in Singapore. So what is differentiated instruction? For some of us who may not be as familiar with it. So differentiated instruction, okay, is an education approach created or coined by Carol Ann Tomlinson, and she's in the University of Virginia. So DI, or differentiation, is the teacher's proactive response to learners' needs. So it's proactive and intentional, and it's shaped by a mindset that are guided by these principles. So what are these principles? The principle or the understanding that the environment needs to support learning and be encouraging, that there's a quality curriculum, that teachers use assessment and they use assessment data and information to inform teaching and learning, to inform the curricular decisions that they make, and that the instruction is often or always trying to respond to student variance, trying to respond to the diverse students' needs. And there's a need to lead and manage students through different routines. And teachers can differentiate through 4 main areas. They can differentiate through these elements of the content that the students are working with, the processes in which the students are making sense of the information or the content, the product, which means like the assessment task or the evidence of how students show their understanding, as well as the affect or the environment. Now, importantly, when teachers are differentiating, they have to pay attention to the student's background. Remember, their students' background and diverse needs, right? Where they're coming from. And that includes looking at the student readiness, okay? That means their proximity to the specified learning goals, okay? How close or far they are to where they need to be at in order to learn and learn well. It's also having to get a sense of what are students' interests. What are they passionate about? What motivates them to learn? What do they find interesting? As well as their learning profile. Learning profile could mean their preferred approaches to learning. How do they prefer to learn? Do they have any preferences? Do they prefer to learn by listening and watching the teacher, or by doing? Or do they prefer to actually work in groups or in pairs, or to work on their own, or to listen to the teacher explain to them? Okay, so their learning preferences. And to cater to this, it is through a range of instructional strategies like these at the bottom. So the fundamental thing to understand from differentiated instruction is a certain kind of a awareness or learner-centeredness, that learners are important, that we need to center learners in the instruction, and that there's a valuation of diversity and appreciation for differences amongst the learners, and trying to see how well we can try to cater to some of these differences. Okay, so this is differentiated instruction. Now, so in my research, I worked with 10 teachers in Singapore. 5 of them are secondary school teachers, and 5 of them are primary school teachers. Okay, and they're teaching English, math, and science. Many of them have had DI training or different kinds of workshop and professional developments in DI already. So how did I collect data to get a sense of how teachers are actually making sense of differentiation and implementing differentiation in the classroom? I had 1 questionnaire and 2 interviews, as well as 4 lesson observations per participant. So in total, that my research assistant and I, we actually went into 39 classrooms to observe 39 lessons. And before these lessons, we talked and we interviewed the teachers. And after these lessons, we talked and we interviewed the teachers to understand what was the rationale behind the lesson, how the lesson went, what challenges they face, and so on. So let's look at some of these findings. So when we look at how teachers implement differentiated instruction in Singapore, okay, how do they implement DI, having borrowed this idea from the USA, okay? In terms of the principle of creating an environment that's a catalyst for learning, in terms of building a community of learner and providing a safe and inclusive classroom environment, the teachers score fairly well. They score moderate evidence of this, from 1.7 to 2.2 out of 3, with 0 being no evidence and 3 being strong evidence. However, in the area of teacher appreciating each child as an individual, right, and encouraging learner independence, the teacher actually shows very, very weak evidence here at this point, okay? So what does this mean? This means that when the teacher actually looks at the students in the classroom, they tend to think about the student as a group rather than as individuals whom they can cater to, right? And also, when it comes to encouraging learner independence, the teachers tend to not focus and emphasize as much on supporting learner independence. And that could be in terms of, for example, encouraging them to self-assess themselves, or giving them choices in their tasks, letting them choose what they want to do amongst many different tasks that are given, or choose the ways in which they want to get there. Okay? So this is the first slide on that. Now let's look at another slide. Okay, this slide is on building a foundation of a quality curriculum. In terms of the first 2 points here, as you can see, teacher intentionally aligns lesson goals to the curriculum, as well as teacher organizing conceptual ideas, essential facts, and skills to help learners learning. You can see that the teachers in Singapore, these 10 teachers, they actually show fairly strong evidence. They are very intentional in thinking about what the goal is, and they craft the lesson such that, it is aligned to the national curriculum, to these goals. However, in terms of ensuring that curriculum is authentic and relevant, they score lower. It's weak evidence here. We don't see as much of that in the classroom, whereby we see, the teachers talking about authenticity of the curriculum or the subject. For example, what does a geographer do? What are the values of a geographer? What are the dispositions? Why is that important? Or making it relevant to the students. For example, why is it important to study language? All right. It's more about, okay, let's study this. This is coming out for the exams, rather than, okay, it's important to study language because it's about being able to communicate clearly with other people. How is this a value addedness in your life? How does this relate in your life? Okay. So in terms of ensuring the curriculum is authentic and relevant, there is a little less of that. Okay. Now, what about in terms of collecting data to inform teaching and learning? So if you look at this, teachers tend to do fairly well, exhibit moderate evidence in terms of collecting data on student readiness. Okay, but in terms of collecting information about students' interests and learning profile, okay, that means what students are interested in, okay, how they prefer to learn. Do they enjoy the group work that is done in class today, or do they prefer to independently work on worksheets and so on? In terms of collecting information around these areas, we see a lower response or lower evidence and weak evidence around there. Now, also in terms of tailoring instruction, overall, we see that, in terms of differentiating the lessons in the classroom, according by either differentiating the learning content or differentiating the learning processes or differentiating the learning products, having different kinds of materials for students to grapple with and so on. Okay. We see also weak evidence around this area. That means teachers are actually not doing very much differentiating in the classroom. There's weak evidence and there's room for improvement around there. So of course, naturally, the question we'll ask is why? Why is it that they're not doing differentiation in the classroom? What are some of these issues or challenges that they're facing, right? So when we interview and talk to the teachers, okay, we showed teachers these patterns of what's going on in the classroom in 39 classrooms that we observed. Then we asked teachers, so why do you think differentiation is a challenge? Or why do you think that we see these patterns across, that there is not a strong focus on focusing on learner independence, or giving choice to learner, or looking at them as an individual? So these are some of the reasons that the teachers are telling us. So the first set of reasons are around issues around socio-cultural reasons. So interestingly, when I polled you earlier in your response of the challenges that your staffs faced in terms of implementing education ideas from abroad, some of you also say the same thing. You talked about culture, right? So what are some of these socio-cultural issues that teachers brought up? First thing is that of teacher directedness. Okay, teacher says that, well, they're a lot more comfortable with a teacher directed education, that in the case of themselves, they themselves grew up in an education system where they're told what to do by their teachers. There's this very strong teacher centeredness or teacher directedness, and because they're used to that and they haven't seen other ways of teaching as much or experienced that very much themselves, so naturally it's a comfortable way for them to teach, right? And even the ones who actually want to try out new ways of teaching, they do say that their colleagues or their students themselves also prefer teacher directedness. So, for example, okay, they say that, well, actually, I do want to try these new ideas, okay, but then I worry that when I try these new ideas, my classroom may be a bit noisy. And if it's a bit noisy, then my colleagues will look at me and ask me, oh, what's going on in your class? Why is your classroom so noisy? Or they're worried that if my classroom is a little bit noisy, then they may actually disturb what's going on in the lesson next door. So they worry about what their peers or their colleagues are thinking. Sometimes they also say that students themselves will say, teacher, this is so troublesome, just tell us the answer. Don't make us do and try to find out the answers ourselves, Students themselves are also not used to it. So sometimes they actually give feedback that this is very tedious or tiring, or they wish that the teachers would just tell them the answers directly because they feel that they're more confident that way when the teachers just tell them the answers. And also there's this notion of teachers saying that, sometimes they feel like they need to take control of the classroom. To them, it's very important that they see that the classroom is in control, there is a classroom management in place. Or they also say that sometimes it's much easier for them to actually decide how to control the timing in the classroom, what to teach. Because if they leave it open to the students and they give students choices and ask students what they're interested in and so on, they worry that they cannot catch up with their students or be able to deliver or help their students in the ways in which the students want. So there's this notion of control that they're worried about as well. At the same time, teachers also talked about strong exam orientation, right? In the case of the Singapore schools, There's a very high stakes exam. There's a national examination at primary 6 level, at secondary 4 level, as well as a junior college level. So teacher says that there are these high stakes exam, and these high stakes exam actually determine where students go thereafter. So they're very concerned with completing the syllabus, and say that, well, there's a lot to cover in the classroom, and then when we have to complete the syllabus, there's so much to cover, there's less time to actually try to collect information about students' interests and their learning preferences, and to try to change in teaching in the classroom so that there can be smaller group instructions where students are working in different tasks in the classroom. So all that take time and energy and effort. So they say that, well, there's less time to do all that. Okay. They also talk about this notion of valuing collectivism. They say, well, this idea of valuing individual students as much, it just doesn't work very well here in Singapore because we are a more collectivist society, right? We value communalism and communal living, right? And in this society, people want to learn as a group, right? Rather than focus on the individual, where we're quite different from the US, where there's a lot of focus on the individual. So, for example, in the US, students, they would wear their own uniforms to students don't wear uniforms to school. They dress in whatever ways they want to, whereas in Singapore, students have to wear uniforms to go to school because we're all part of a collective. That is what that represents. So then they talk about, okay, then it's kind of difficult to implement some of these ideas from DI, where I have to value the students as individual and think about their interest. Okay. And they also talk about this notion of face, that they want to give face to students, or they don't want to make students lose face. So they don't want to embarrass students or point out which groups may be actually slower or faster, or who's doing well or less well, or who has more particular interests, or who has different kinds of interests. So they feel that their students may not be very comfortable with being pointed out as well. So they want to give face, to their students. Also, they're worried about their parents or the colleagues or their students, and they worry whether or not the parents or colleagues will think that this is fair, whether doing different things in the classroom, having different interests, having choice will be fair for everyone. They also talk about these issues of different difficulties around technological issues. When I say technological issues here, I don't mean IT. I don't mean just IT, like information technology. Technological here would be things around structures and resources and techniques. So they talk about the structures. Well, in Singapore, the classroom structures is very different. They say, we have a very large class size of 40, right? Up to 40 students. So then they'll say in the US, maybe the classroom sizes are much smaller. They only have 20 something students, or 16 students or 18 students. So it's much easier for the teachers to do, instruction that's very learner centered. Also, they also talk about the furniture set up in the classroom, that the furniture is set up to be in rows facing the teachers rather than in groups. So this then makes group work much more difficult. Or they say that in terms of timetabling, well, it can be a bit challenging with timetabling, because with the timetabling, they teach in specific blocks of time. So if I'm an English teacher or if I'm a math teacher, when I'm done, I leave the classroom, okay, and another teacher come in. So if a timetable period is very short, if it's just 30 minutes for a single period, then sometimes it's hard for them to do these more learner-centered instruction, where they have to give instructions to students to say, okay, now this is what you have to do, then we have to break into groups, and then we come back again. So all that will take time, and maybe they'll need at least an hour to do that kind of instruction usually. And they also say that in terms of material, sometimes it's just difficult to locate differentiated teaching resources, right? It's much easier to just teach with one set of teaching materials rather than to have to think about planning many different sets for different groups of students in the classroom. Unlike in the US, perhaps, in the US, there is a larger ecosystem set up where there are a lot of private vendors selling different kinds of educational materials for students. And then in terms of workload, teachers talk about heavy workload, that there's a commitment to non-teaching duties, and then sometimes they feel fatigued because they feel that, well, they have to think about, they have to prepare for committee work or extracurricular activities, and then so there's less time for them to devote to actually marking very quickly, or to actually spending a lot of time in lesson planning. And also, even if, remember just now I showed you a slide, and out of these 10 teachers, all of them have had some form of professional development with differentiation. And the PD, the professional development, actually range from a few days to actually 13 weeks or a consistent amount of time. Even these teachers who have participated in professional development, they still feel very uncertain about these techniques and they feel very uncertain about their own personal competence. They keep asking, am I correct? Okay, is this correct? Is what I'm doing correct? So because of where they're coming from, okay, how they've grown up and their lack of experience, they keep asking themselves, is this correct? Is this what the right way to do differentiation? Okay. Okay, let's look at the implications then. So what does this mean? And as many of you have actually pointed out in the challenges poll, right? When we borrow education ideas from UK or Australia or USA or Saudi Arabia or India, okay, into a new context, where these transnational education ideas, they take on very different meanings because the local context is very different from the foreign context. So for us as leaders, what does that mean for us then? Okay, if we are leading educational change in our school or in a classroom or in our education district, right? Or in a, so what it means is that we have to understand also what the limitations and the potentials for cross-national educational transfers. And perhaps it's important to actually spend time, having long conversations about how and to what extent transfer will work and what parts of this education policies or ideas may actually be aligned or suitable in your educational context and which parts may not be as suitable and which we may downplay a little bit. So I bring you to this idea, this framework to look at, okay? So, and I call this a comparative educational change framework, in that when we think about educational ideas, okay, that's coming from overseas, I think it's often very helpful if we can consider two things. First thing is to consider the origin context around here. So what's happening in the origin? And secondly, to also consider what is happening in the destination context. Okay, and what are the pieces within there to consider that we can break down to consider? First thing we can think about possibly is social cultural pieces. What are some of these norms or values or behaviors that are shaped by geography or history or culture or politics, okay, or policies in these different countries? What are these social cultural norms that is present in the origin context and how does it differ in the destination context? Second area you can think about is technological. Okay, there's blue lens over here. So imagining this is a periscope and you're looking through the origin and the destination lens and you're trying to see how you can use these educational ideas, right? So technological, think about the processes, the structures, and the expertise. What kind of structures are in place in your own countries? What kind of structures are in place in this overseas context or the origin countries from which education ideas come from? How are these structures similar or different? Is there anything else that you need to therefore then do to actually change your own structure so that it is more supportive, so that it can support this new education approach that's coming from elsewhere? That's another thing that one can consider. Or think about the political. The political will be areas around negotiation, persuasion, power, or authority. By politics here, I also could mean like teachers, they're very concerned about the politics of how to actually deal with the parents, how to deal with the students, how to deal with their other colleagues, how to deal with their bosses. Okay, how do teachers then have to handle negotiating across all these different players? Okay, because ultimately what then happens is that in a very postmodern world, there's a lot of chaos and a lot of conflicts and a lot of tensions because when ideas come from overseas to a new context, there's a lot of conflicts. And these conflicts are what we call these kind of postmodern tensions that teachers are facing. Okay. So what other implications can we consider? So I've spent quite some time talking about this critical examination of curricular and pedagogical approaches from overseas as well. So earlier on, I talked about examining what these contexts look like, thinking about the pieces around sociocultural differences, thinking about pieces around technological, around political differences. Okay, in thinking about these things, we can also consider next thing is the critical examination of the curricular and pedagogical approaches from overseas. By that, it means to examine what are these underlying assumptions around teaching, learning, or learners. So, for example, in the case of differentiated instruction, what are the assumptions that the scholar, like Tomlinson, is making around differentiated instruction? The assumption is that learners are important. They need to be centered. The assumption is based on certain philosophies. The philosophy will be that diversity is important, individualism is important. And then we can ask, okay, so then in our own context, to what extent is individualism important? And if it's not, to what extent then is this idea helpful or useful in our context? And should we actually embrace some of these educational ideas? Okay. It can also be helpful if we can have inclusive conversations on the goals of education, because ultimately education is in tandem. It works in tandem with what we want society to be, right? Next, as we think about professional development for teachers, we also need to understand that professional development alone is not sufficient for teachers. We can give the teachers a lot of professional development, but they may find that it's still a struggle to change or to use this new teaching approach. Okay, we can say that, the stakeholders cannot understand these new educational ideas in spite of this training. Sometimes they may not be able to understand it because some of these structures haven't shifted in a classroom. So, for example, if the structure in the classroom is that there's a lot of people in the classroom, like 50 students in the classroom, they may then find that, well, even if I know that I want to center learners and I want to, and this is something that I really want to do, but I find that as a human, it's hard for me to engage all 50 of them individually and to know each 50 of them very well. And on top of that, if I have 4 classes that I teach, that will be 200 students that I have to know. It's just very difficult. So structures may also need to change as well in order to support them. So just giving teachers more professional development may not be helpful because there may be other things that's going on, high workload in their lives, or not having the space to have professional conversations with their peers that may actually impede some of these adaptation or implementation of educational ideas. Teachers may also need support. Okay, other than professional development, what kind of other support do they need? It could be in terms of working groups, working in groups to make sense of new ideas, or structuring protected time for them to meet or to discuss, allowing them to have professional conversations. The teachers in my study who reported having more successes with implementing differentiated instructions, they're the ones who tend to work in a group with their peers. So as a group, they all work together and they share resources together. So they find that it's much easier for them to implement educational change. Okay. And also, I think we need to pay attention to the fact that teachers may also need emotional support. Oftentimes, we feel that, we just get teachers to do things. But, in terms of having the content with all these new educational ideas, they actually feel a lot of tensions within them. So sometimes we also may need to think about how we can pay attention to the emotional or mental health well-being. Having conversations, talking about how they're feeling, the tensions that they're feeling, the stress that they're feeling, where is it coming from, can be helpful for them. Okay, so these are some ideas that we can consider. So really, in terms of thinking about borrowing education ideas from elsewhere, we understand that there can be challenges. It may not be impossible to use some of these ideas, but I think what we need to do in some is to really pay very close attention to these different contextual pieces. Like I mentioned, sociocultural pieces, technological pieces, political pieces, to see what it's like in the source context and what is it like in the origin context, and to have deep and long conversations about to what extent some of these ideas would work, what parts may need to be modified, okay, and which sections or which structures in our own school or what cultures does the school also need to modify, and to have big conversations, inclusive conversations involving people to discuss these ideas. Okay, and with that, I conclude my session today. I understand I don't seem to have much time left. I think the poll took a little longer than I expected today. So I think we have about 5 minutes for questions and answers now.
We have we have a few questions here. Okay, the
Okay.
first question, Dr. Heng. Is differentiated instruction feasible and practicable in all school contexts? That's the first question.
Okay, so that's a complicated question too, because I'm not sure what this all school context mean. All as in all kinds of countries around the world. I'm just going to assume that it means in all kinds of countries around the world, in any kinds of school context, be it small classroom, big classroom, etc., etc. As you can see from my study today, from my own study, and I have to say though that this study is only with 10 teachers. It's not representative of the entire Singapore teacher population. There may be a lot of other teachers who are doing very well. But with these 10 teachers, we can see that, even though Singapore is coming from a highly resourced country, the teachers have a lot of training, they still face some kind of issues around cultures, understanding, appreciating the students, also their structural issues, classroom size problems that they face. So to answer that question, I would say that DI can work in some contexts and may find it harder to work in other contexts. DI might probably work better in contexts which is more similar to the original source context. So for example, differentiated instruction has been borrowed to Europe, to countries in Europe as well, in the Netherlands, in the UK as well. And in those contexts, DI may actually work a little better because structurally they may have smaller class sizes. Okay. They may have more liberal views about education and how to relate to learners. So in terms of teacher uptake, it might be actually, there may be less barriers around there. But in very different locations, perhaps if we're talking about differentiated instruction in parts of Indonesia where the class sizes may be big, or in parts of China where class sizes can go up to 60, then some parts of differentiated instruction will be fairly challenging. You can learn to do things like getting assessment data to get a better sense of where your students are at to pitch, but yet it may then be challenging to have lots of grouping or choice in the classroom. So it's a complicated question. I don't have a straightforward answer to this. My straightforward answer to this is it really depends on the source and origin or destination context.
Okay.
And then
All right.
Dr.
Now,
Salva, there's a second question?
yes, there's a second
Yeah.
question. Is
Mm.
differentiated instruction meant for all teachers or those who have undergone specialization, training, teaching, and have acquired specialized skills?
Mm.
Is it only for
Oh,
special people?
okay. I would say that we can't say, I wouldn't say that differentiated instruction is only for special teachers or special people. And actually, to be fair, also for some of the participants in my study, some of these teachers, they themselves are reading up about differentiated instruction themselves, right? They read books about it, well, and they try to learn, they watch videos about it. So they learn it themselves as well, okay? So my short answer to that is that everyone can learn to differentiate, okay? But because differentiated instruction comes with many pieces, having to understand assessment, having to understand students, having to have good classroom management, and so on and so forth, sometimes some beginning teachers may find it a bit challenging to actually manage because there's so many pieces that they have to contend with. So for beginning teachers, it may be difficult to try to start differentiating instruction in the classroom. So for more experienced teachers who actually already have more experience with classroom management, they know the curriculum very well, they know the content well, and so on. They know assessment skills and techniques and so on well. They may then find that it's much easier for them to apply all these together. Yeah.
Okay. One final question. Okay,
Yes.
this is something I personally like. Given the popularity of educational transfer worldwide, does it
Mm.
mean that education systems around the world are becoming increasingly similar?
Okay. So this question is a question that comparative and international educators, people who do work, or scholars who do work in this field of comparative education and international education, they have big debates about this. Okay. In some ways, for those who work at a policy level and who look at education from a macro perspective, one camp of scholars will argue that yes, actually, in some ways, if you look at how education is uh, is taking place around the world with globalization, with these global league tables, with ed policy reforms that's pushed through by transnational organization, they will argue that actually, in many ways, you can see that education is becoming increasingly similar around the world, especially when we talk about things like learner-centered education. Many countries in the world talk about learner-centered education, how it's important to consider where the learners are at. right? And if we talk about and think about assessment, how it's important to think about assessment and using assessment data, and then using the assessment data to provide feedback. So in these ways, how we think about doing education, where we actually emphasize learner-centeredness, using assessment in the classroom, some researchers will actually argue that yes, education around the world is increasingly similar if you look at China or Singapore or Korea or the US. But yet on the other camp, educational researchers, okay, who are looking at a very close level of what is actually going on in the classroom, will argue, actually, that's not true. It may seem like it is actually becoming similar, where people around the world, they're all talking about learner-centered education. But if you look very, very closely in the classroom, that classroom space actually looks very different in China versus in the US. How teachers think about learner-centeredness in the US is very different in terms of how teacher thinks about learner-centeredness in China. Okay, there's all these inflections of the local culture there. So there's a big debate around here. I don't have a straightforward answer to that. Maybe this is a question that I will want to pose to all my participants as well. Maybe this is something that y'all can think beyond here. Do you think that education systems are becoming increasingly similar? If so, in what ways? And if not, in what other ways?
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Heng. So we don't have much time, so I think we have to wrap up. So with this, we conclude this webinar. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We hope you have learned and enjoyed this presentation. I would like to thank Dr. Prema for helping me with the chat, the Educational Technology Division, MOE, for the platform, and our lovely rapporteurs. Please do not forget, our next webinar series will be held coming Thursday, that is 1st October, and it will be live at 9 a.m. Malaysian time. Till then, goodbye from Malaysia. Take care and have a good day.